Welcome to this edition of Theological Journals. If the Lord be for us, who can be against us? We're now in Anglican Theological Journal reviewing Tanner's article on Christology, which has some things in it that are of concern, such as universalism, Hegelianizing. Because the life of Jesus has been established in the world in this way, other human beings can be joined to him, share in this healing. The perfected humanity of Jesus is the means of our salvation. Tanner says we are saved as we are united with him, perfected and glorified in faith and love. This takes place, according to Tanner, by the Spirit. The Spirit radiates the humanity of Jesus with the Father's own gifts of light, life, and love, and shines through him, not simply back to the Father, but through his humanity to us, thereby communicating to us the gifts received by Jesus from the Father. Other human beings receive the Spirit as a pledge, as a sign that they are claimed of Christ's own, that they are now part of his company. The Spirit in Tanner's word attaches them to Christ. And then the Spirit that they've received begins to work on the material of their lives. The Spirit awakens justifying faith that adheres and cleaves to Christ. The Spirit animates their participation in the Eucharistic community, drawing them to praise, prayer, and worship empowered by the Spirit. And the Spirit works on them, however uneven and partial the results may be, to turn them to lives of service to God, entering into the conflicts and struggles of history for the betterment of the world. For Tanner, in other words, the incarnation is the establishment by God in the midst of the sinful world of a human life, wholly filled with God's light, life, and love. The work of salvation is the Spirit's drawing of other human beings into union with this one human life, and so into union with God. We're looking for evidence of the prophetic, priestly, and kingly roles of Jesus. The Spirit works out this work of salvation in the midst of the world of creatures by means of creaturely processes. The Spirit works through preaching, baptism, celebration of the Eucharist, slow or sudden transformation of human patterns of affection, thought, speech, and action. The Spirit, Tanner says, works gradually in and through the usual human and fully fallible, often messy and conflict-ridden public processes of give and take in the ordinary life. The work of the Spirit in salvation is mediated through the process of the actions of human beings. Now for Trinity Theological Journal, a new article by Backfish on repetition in the Book of Judges. The methodology used. Most people can hardly repeat a statement without some kind of variation, so methodological guidelines are needed to distinguish meaningful variations from incidental ones. Jerome Walsh's methodology is instructive. My rule of thumb is this: given that Hebrew prose style does not object to verbatim repetition, I presume that the narrator has a purpose in mind when he varies the wording of repetition. So if I can think of any plausible reason for a variation other than stylistic ornamentation, that is, variation just for the sake of variation with no impact on the meaning of the passage, I will tend to prefer it. Only when I cannot think of any such alternative will I settle for stylistic ornamentation. A similar approach will be taken here with the following additional indicators of relevance for meaning. Number one, subverted expectations. When the narrator builds reader expectation to expect verbatim repetition, but instead introduces a change in a word or action, meaningful variation will be considered likely. For example, when Sisera follows Jael's instructions verbatim, readers expect Barak to do likewise in the parallel exchange, but when he does not, the change probably reveals something significant about the characters. Judges 4:22. Lengthening or significant changes. If verbatim repetition or summary would have been easier, but instead the repetition includes lengthening or significant changes, meaningful variation will be considered likely. This happens when Delilah changes her appeals to Samson to disclose the secret of his strength. Judges 16. Number three, contribution to other supported features of the text. When a varied repetition comports with other rhetorical features in the narrative, a meaningful variation will be considered likely. For example, Gideon's retribution against Sukkot and Penuel escalates beyond his promised punishment, mirroring his characterization throughout the narrative. Now for Episcopal History, article on international relations and the Lambeth Conferences. Indeed, increasingly the Anglican bishops look not to principles of international relations, but to territorial conflicts. At the Lambeth Conference 1988, Resolution 27, War, Violence, and Justice acknowledged a thaw in the Cold War and hoped for new opportunities of cooperation with the Soviet Union. After this conference turned intently towards specific regional conflicts, Lebanon and Israel, Latin America, and in Namibia and Sudan. In the Lambeth Conference of 1998, the vision of the church at large in the world was preserved not by discussions of international relation, by the adoption of an international campaign to release poor countries from their debts. Resolution 1.4, a fruitful response to aggression and war, and Resolution 111 dissolved into brief clauses which were so attenuated that they had little effect altogether. It is possible to argue that these later reports move from one understanding of international relations to another, which emphasize violent political developments within nations, while economic injustice, which was once regarded as a cause of war, had been detached from that issue and had found a life of its own in an independent category. Anglicans began to interpret their world and the place of the church within it on essentially new terms. That sense of narrowing vision, even so hard to resist. The preference for internationalism and the institutions which gave life and meaning was still discernible. But resolutions which expressed this looked increasingly like an inherited duty. Conclusions. The Lambeth Conferences did not exist primarily to express a thorough, critical view of international relations. Yet, if this was so, discussion of war and peace still involved much time and discussion at the conferences, and the resolutions which they placed before the world were presented with a high purpose. We will continue that as we begin to move towards closing the end of that. We are now on a book review. The book is entitled The Episcopate, the Role of Bishops in a Shared Future, edited by Andrew Doyle and published this year. The second section of this volume begins with Catherine Jefferts Shorey's chapter, Women Leaders Enable Leadership by All. The former presiding bishop examines the role of women leaders in the church throughout history. Here we go with Katie. As well as the obstacles that have challenged the full participation of women in leadership. She reminds the readers that there is an important theological point involved in equity within the church. The variety of God's creation means no one individual or clan, sect, species, gender, or pride-filled dominant group can bear the fullness of the divine image. It takes the whole creation to begin to approach that fullness. Cheryl Holbrook's chapter, Women and the Episcopacy, Insights for Ecclesiology, affirms women's entry into the ordained ministry as the most significant transformation in pastoral leadership in the 20th century, if not since the Reformation. Holbrook is one of several authors in this volume who stress the significance of discipleship for the future of ministry. She underlines the significance of stories from women bishops for noting how the church understands itself, its ecclesiology. Hector Monterroso, formerly Bishop of Costa Rica and now assistant in the Diocese of Texas, points out the importance of the bishop as a visionary, but also reminds readers of the experience of the church in Latin America, of the gospel's preferential option for the poor, and of emphases called for in the Episcopal Church's ministry in Latin America, where its identity is called into question. Robert Fitzpatrick, Bishop of Hawaii, addresses the bishop amid multicultural context and reflects on his experience in terms drawn from the Hawaiian language and culture. Robert Wright's essay, The Ministry of Bishop as Leadership, begins the section of the book that directly addresses the bishop's role as leader. Wright, Bishop of Atlanta, insists that the church must learn from contemporary study of effective leadership now going on outside the church, and emphasizes the creative tension between the bishop's authority, which derives from the episcopal title and role, and leadership, which speaks of the bishop's individual agency. We'll resume that somewhat later as we turn to another book review, Trauma and Survival in the Contemporary Church, Historical Responses of the Anglican Tradition. An entirely different kind of trauma was created in 1896 by Pope Leo XIII's bull Apostolicae Curae, which declared Anglican ordination null and void. The result, a lasting stumble block to mutual recognition of holy orders, much less to reunion. J. Louis Duzon posits that an overemphasis on apostolic succession serves as an unconscious compensation for Leo's edict. Thomas Power traces the exodus of Irish Anglicans from their homeland to English Canada during the 1820s, a migration marked by violence against Protestants. Violence also took place from 1919 to 1923, when the Irish Free State was formed. Brian Walker notes that the attacks upon the Protestant minority, though tension was soon alleviated. Victoria Matthews, Bishop of Christchurch, New Zealand, presents her side of the controversy surrounding the rebuilding of the city's cathedral in the wake of 2010 earthquake. The book's title is a bit misleading unless one describes events as distant as 2 centuries ago as part of the contemporary church. At times, one wishes for more supporting detail. What, for example, was the predicament of the native Canadian residential and industrial school that forced Blake to take his militant stand? Did the rise of Protestant neo-orthodoxy with its exposition of Christian realism affect positions taken within the Canadian churchmen? If the fate of Mary Tampkin was not usual, where can one find supporting data? What are the broader implications of Neelan's 3-page account? As it is, this admittedly eclectic collection contains some fascinating data. Pick that up as we shift to table talk. And the treatment of servant wives, Exodus 21, verses 7 through 11. The Book of the Covenant, Exodus 21 to 23, in applying God's law to specific situations, gives case law describing particular scenarios and how to use the law in addressing them. It does not cover every possible situation, and there would be no end to stipulations if it was tried. It gives paradigmatic examples that the legal authorities in ancient Israel could apply to similar cases. Thus, we should not think that the principles behind any of the specific applications in the Book of the Covenant were limited to the situation described. Rather, these principles could be used elsewhere. Thus, many of the principles given for the treatment of male slaves or servants in 21, 1-6 were applied in other cases, even in cases involving female servants. Yet, given that women were in a more vulnerable social position than men in the ancient Near East, specific laws for females were also needed. We see this in today's passage. If he does not do any of these things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. Exodus 21, 7 to 11 addresses the treatment of female slaves, but not those who were merely slaves. In view are situations where a woman was made both a servant and a wife. A man would pay both a dowry and a labor fee to the woman's family to take her first as servant, and then as wife for himself or for his son. Her status was less than that of an indentured worker, and more than that of a wife whose children have different inheritance rights than the children of a man's first wife. For example, a man might take a second wife or concubine, as many of the patriarchs did. Or a widower who already had children might remarry. The Mosaic law says that the firstborn son has inheritance rights that cannot be negotiated away, Deuteronomy 21:15 to 17. So giving a second wife a servant status would help safeguard the rights of children born to the man's first wife. But although the wife envisioned in today's passage was of a lower social status than a man's first wife, she had to be protected. If during the probationary period of service before marriage the man was displeased with her, he could not sell her to another man, but had to allow her to be redeemed. If the man married her and took other wives, he had to provide for her just as well as other wives. If the man paid the bride a price to take her as a wife for son, he was required to treat her just as he would treat a daughter. If he failed in any of these areas, he had to release her from her status as servant or slave without demanding a redemption price. We turn now to the article on the doctrine of man as the image of God. No other creature receives such a detailed account because no other creature compares. Humanity is God's best work, and he suspends the rhythm of his unfolding story so that he will appreciate the introduction of creation's most excellent creature. The structure and style of the text shows this, but the text also tells us this expressly when it says that humankind alone is created in God's image. What the Bible says. If the way that the Bible presents the creation of man points to his importance relative to the rest of creation, and what the Bible says about man points to his unique essence relative to the Creator, the other creatures find their places in their respective kingdoms. Man finds his ultimate place in his relationship to God. He is the only one in all creation who touches both earth and heaven. His very essence is that he is in fact made in the likeness of God. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Man as the image of God is the most important assertion the Bible makes about creation. It shows that man's priority in creation and his dominion over its flow from the essence of God's image. This indicates the underlying unity of the human race, which applies to humanity's two complementary genders. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, him male and female. He created them. God's making man in his image parallels God's making them, that is, male and female, in his image. Both are equals in this. Both male and female equally have fellowship with God. Both equally receive the knowledge of God's moral will. Both equally share in the mandate to rule the earth by tending and guarding the garden sanctuary. Without Eve, it is not good that man should be alone. With Eve, Adam has a companion who corresponds to him, understands him, communicates with him as his equal. The unity of our race is rooted in the fact that every member of the human race is an image bearer. Every person we meet, no matter their particular ethnicity or ethnicities, represents God's best handiwork. That is enough for a person to receive respect and to be treated with dignity, no matter their sex, their race or age, whether born or unborn, whether Christian or not. They are image bearers. They are our kind. How ridiculous it is to bless God and then in the next moment curse a person who is made in the likeness of God. James 3:9. How reprehensible and consequential it is to shed human blood because God made man in his own image. Genesis 9:6. God's image bearers represent the best of God's creation. Even if a person has not professed faith in Christ as his Creator, Savior, and Lord, he is to be treated with dignity that every member of our race deserves. He is fallen, but he is still a human being. We will finish that up tomorrow as we turn to Protestant Reformed Theological Journal. Answer a Fool. Do Not Answer a Fool by Professor Corey Grice. To understand the text of Proverbs, we must first remind ourselves who the fool is, according to Proverbs. Since the next text puts us in the realm of the audible and written word that has attacked us, we ought to stick to the description of a fool, as Proverbs displays him in the use of tongue and pen. According to the inspired preacher, the fool is one who turns his tongue into an instrument of his pride. With the weapon of his tongue he fights not falsehood, but he beats and pierces those who have offended his pride. Like a drunk chiding his wife, he thinks that he is reinforcing his status in the minds of listeners, when in fact he only lays open his folly. 13:6. Further, in the fool's lips are lies that are an abomination to the Lord. 12:22. He will not tell the full truth, but will vehemently protest that he is doing so. But his lies, he has the immediate reward of convincing some his victory is momentary. If instead he would speak the truth, his lips would be established forever. 12:19. The Hebrew dictionaries tell us the fool's lying tongue can be the falsity of self-deceived prophets. Others have not deceived them. Instead, they have deceived themselves. Yet they cast the blanket of self-deceit over others. Jeremiah 23:22. The fool's tongue utters slander. 10:18. Slander is a specific kind of lie about others and what they have said or done. It involves taking the person's words and making them seem to say something that is not the intent of the speaker nor the honest reading of his words. The fool seeks to do mischief. 10:23 with his words. He wants to create turmoil, to ignite an uproar, but then he can exploit the fearful. His words are really the expression of rage that has consumed him. 14:16. With his writing and speaking, he's not interested in understanding, but merely wants to unleash what is pent up within him. His words are deceitful and crooked. He twists things to fit his agenda. 4:24, 6:12, and 19:1. With his mouth and pen, he is attempting to lift himself up instead of letting others exalt him if it is due. His speech, therefore, is like an uncontrolled fire. So, should we answer when one speaks or writes this way, seemingly with no shame? It depends. Answer not. Answer not. We are not to answer this kind of folly if the consequence is that we are dragged into this kind of speaking or writing ourselves. Verse 4 tells us not to answer then, lest thou also be like him. The temptation is to answer in like manner, to hurl back what has been hurled at us. It is better not to answer. In cases like this, silence may speak the most powerfully. There is time to allow foolishness to show itself folly. When the Rabshakeh was carrying on his folly, calling out to the inhabitants of Jerusalem that Hezekiah was deceiving them and they ought to come out and join Assyria, Hezekiah must have felt a strong desire to mount the wall as pulpit and response. Instead, his command was, answer him not. In many cases, responding will spur the one spewing foolishness to continue on in his folly. His rage fuels him, and answering only provides an open door to pour forth more folly. Wisdom will not win him now. Speak not in the ears of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of your words. Proverbs 23:9. He will only continue to twist your words and make baseless attacks, for his pursuit of victory leads him to set aside all other considerations. Though one wants to answer again and again to set the record straight, it only draws one into an exhaustingly endless match that does not honor the Lord and only brings one under the judgments due a fool. This may well explain the silence at times in recent PRCA history. There are occasions when an answer to folly must be risked. The inspired preacher tells us that these are occasions when the consequences of not answering is that the one playing the fool becomes wise in his own eyes. In other words, there are occasions when the puffed up in pride, thinking he has won the day for wisdom because no answer has been given. Others, hearing him boast, start to be overcome and snared by the folly and propagators of it. In other words, an answer must be given where there is a risk to God's people that they not be taken in by such folly. How astounding that this can happen. People who have thoroughly imbibed the Reformed creeds can be convinced by strong personalities that their church is heretical for holding to the creeds. All the while, the personalities twist the meaning of the creeds to meet their own agenda. We turn our attention to the beginning of an article, The Commitment of Silas. Search the Scriptures by Mr. Kyle, who teaches New Testament history at Covenant Christian High School in Grand Rapids and is a member of Faith, PRC. The Commitment of Silas. And Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren under the grace of God. In nearly 100 years of Protestant Reformed churches, missions have been part of our history. Soon after the development of this new denomination through the faithful defense of sovereign particular grace, early ecclesiastical meetings recognized the need to develop a system and structure for missionary work. In 1928, a mission committee was officially formed. The question of how will we do missions was posed and wrestled with by the classis. Over the course of her history, 12 Protestant Reformed ministers have left their calling as local pastors and ventured into the mission field. The first being a mission to Canada in 1950 by Reverend Mikke. On average, 6 years have been spent by missionaries on their respective fields, including those who are serving as foreign missionaries in the present. We will pick that up on our next engagement as we turn to Bibliotheca Sacra, a chronology on the Nativity. Rabbi Hafala's record provides important information. First, it notes that the course of Jehoram was serving at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Second, it records that it was the eve preceding the 9th of Ab on the 7th. Third, it says it was the close of Sabbath. This information allows us to recreate the week of Ab 8 to 14 and weeks leading up to it. Reckoning backward, the preceding week would have been Ab 1 to 7, then Tammuz 23 to 29, then Tammuz 16 to 22, and so forth ad infinitum. Additionally, Halafta's report makes clear that the courses were not static, but advanced in some way or another. Otherwise, Jehoram, whose service commenced the 1st and 25th weeks of the priestly cycle, would not have been serving in the month of Abib, which is the 11th month, and about the 44th week. On 2 separate occasions, the temple services commenced in the 7th month of Tishri, first under Solomon, then when the temple was restored in the time of Ezra. Tishri, therefore, marked the commencement of the temple service and the priestly cycle, which presumably have still been true when the temple was destroyed in AD 70. Turn our attention to modern Reformation. Whatever aggressive tactics they may have utilized, the fathers were characterized by humility that considered their own theology in need of development. For example, in AD 325, the creed written at Nicaea was a monumental declaration in favor of the Son's eternal generation. Nevertheless, in the condemnatory appendix, the fathers still considered hypostasis and ousia as synonymous. Between 325 and the final codification at Constantinople in 381, the fathers reevaluated and later entertained the possibility that their own articulation of Trinitarian vocabulary needed refinement. In that interim, they acknowledged the potential for misunderstanding. Treating hypostasis or hypostasis and ousia as synonyms could sound like person and essence should not be distinguished. Rather than doubling down, however, they humbled themselves and further refined their Trinitarian grammar so that no misunderstanding could occur between hypostasis and ousia. In the end, the controversy that threatened to divide the church brought the church together. Some of those previously hesitant to affirm Nicene Trinitarianism were brought into the fold. Its progress was only possible because the same fathers who were unflinching in their opposition to those unwilling to leave subordination behind were also unpretentious enough to refine their vocabulary for those who were open to Nicaea, but nonetheless reticent due to lingering confusion. In a similar vein, who is not encouraged to see so many churches and pastors today acknowledging past deviance from Nicene orthodoxy, either in their own theological education or present church, only to follow through with a willingness to take the next steps to reform? I propose that this is the way forward. Such humility will be the beginning of concord, consecration for the sake of unification. We all long for the church to be one, but if the church is not holy first, then unity is a mirage. Christ will build his church, tradition as gardener and guardian. If such a bold claim is true, that his controversy is instrumental to the doctrine of sanctification and unity of Christ's church, then what strategies might lead those in the oven of controversy toward a solution? I offer the following strategies with recent controversy over the doctrine of God in plain view. These strategies for a solution assume, however, that missteps with the doctrine of God are only a symptom. The virus itself is in the bloodstream and must be identified. Otherwise, evangelicals will continue to suffer the symptoms. At the end of the Nicene Creed, our fathers confess their belief in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. The fathers did not believe any of these ecclesiastical attributes were optional, and they also considered each mark indispensable to the next, a web of inseparable silk strands. That point is worth emphasizing because everyone desires the church to be one. Yet evangelicals rarely recognize that for the church to be one, it must remove itself from the Church Catholic, that is universal. Unity in the present is achieved when we embrace the unity of the past. Should we ever sever ourselves from those brothers and sisters of Christ across the ages, cutting ourselves off from the Church Universal, leave ourselves disconnected from the apostolic witness? How can we confess the faith once delivered for all, a faith around which we should unite, if we do not consider ourselves accountable to the faith once for all delivered to the saints? Turn now to Calvin's Theological Journal. Key passages regarding the prosperity gospel in Nigeria. As for the exegetical approach to the biblical texts, these passages are read in their total context, social, historical, and literary, which will help the biblical interpreter have a tentative understanding of the primary divine author's intention. Due to the influence of secularism, relativism, and postmodernism, some may claim that the author's intent is inaccessible to the biblical interpreter. But according to Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart, perusing scholarly works and tools such as good translations of the Bible, a good Bible dictionary, and good Bible commentaries, especially multi-authored and exegetical works, and asking questions regarding the context and content of the text help to discover what the original authors intended. The perspective regarding authorial intent used in this article is in line with Thomas Schreiner's assertion that what God intended to communicate through the medium of human authors is what they meant, using the words they said or wrote. Divine authorship does not eliminate human authorship or meaning. The selected Christian preachers have misinterpreted the biblical texts to teach prosperity and have provided a contextual interpretation of these texts in the Nigerian context. As a result, they do not give due weight to the authorial intention of these texts in their application. But a theological reading of these texts, which focuses on the context of the Bible, draws out the intended meaning of these texts before applying them to the Nigerian context, and bridges the connection of the interpretation of the text to the present. Application of the biblical text can be many, but the interpretation of the texts are singular and historical. We turn now to discussion, a book review of Zeba Crook's The Ancient Mediterranean Social World. For the most part, sources are introduced briefly and clearly and with sufficient context for the reader to benefit from the primary source. The supplementary lists of references are generous, often including more than 100 additional references for the reader to look up. For anyone conducting research in one of the 20 core areas treated in this source book, the lists of keywords and additional references alone might commend the purchase of this volume. On the other hand, non-specialists may not benefit enough from the limited collection of 20 primary citations displayed in each chapter. By design, there are no general discussions of topics like citizenship within the polis, daily life in the agora, or the interactions between various schools of philosophy or factions in early Jerusalem. The potential advantage to this approach is that the reader may benefit from focusing directly on concrete examples of other chapter topics. By examining each primary source example in relative isolation, the reader is free to consider each example on its own terms without necessarily blurring the lines with other examples. The reader will ultimately need to assess how each collection fleshes out with the proposed chapter topic. The same stated emphasis on topics like honor and shame throughout the volume is generally illuminating. The social scientific approach yields fresh insights and definitions for these important concepts. Shame is not the opposite of honor. The concern people have to show honor to others. The worst kind of person in the world is the shameless person, one who cannot be shamed into falling in line with the group. On the other hand, honor was the status once claimed in the community, together with the all-important public recognition of that claim. Lacking public recognition, honor claims were the boast of fools. These concepts also carry ramifications for related social topics. Honor and shame are such powerful social values because the world was collectivistic. What others thought of you was extremely important to many people. Their opinion not only mattered, but it shaped and constrained people's options. With respect to the biblical literature, the methodology for selecting source texts differs throughout the volume. Examples of biblical events are just likely to be cited from translations of the Septuagint, as well as the Masoretic text. There are little to no nuanced discussions or reflections on the unique transmission histories and theological distinctions that exist among the sources. There are also some idiosyncrasies that emerge from the accompanying commentaries, as we find with the primary citation of Luke 6:13. The full excerpt reads, "You cannot serve God and mammon," preceding by the accompanying commentary, "Mistrust of money by the non-elite was common." Given that each chapter only concludes commentaries for 20 primary source citations, one might reasonably question whether these 15 words should suffice. There, the description of being thrown into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, is reduced to a mere loss of honor, loss of reputation. Although these two are the most extreme examples, there are other places in this volume that could have benefited from more nuanced discussions. Overall, the strength of the volume is found in its user-friendly format, as it offers an accessible orientation to primary sources. Unfortunately, for the general audience, the variable quality of the accompanying commentaries may not live up to expectations. We'll bring that to a close. Glory be to the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.